The hallways were alive with noise. Lockers slammed shut with sharp metallic clangs, sneakers squeaked and scuffed against the shiny linoleum floor, and snippets of loud conversation bounced off the walls. The air smelled faintly of chalk dust and the faint, tangy aroma of cafeteria food wafting in from a distance. It was a typical day at Cedar Heights Academy, where the students flowed like a river, each one swept up in their own lives, too busy to notice much of anything outside their immediate circles. But right there, in the middle of the moving crowd, stood Malik. He wasn't shouting or laughing like the others. He wasn't running down the hallway or weaving his way through clusters of students. He was just there. Quiet. Watching. At first glance, you might think he was just another middle school kid blending into the background. Small for his age, with a backpack slightly too big for his slim frame, Malik could easily be mistaken for someone shy, even forgettable. But to those who knew him, Malik was anything but forgettable. His brown eyes held a kind of quiet intensity, as though they saw things no one else noticed. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his words carried weight, though most of his classmates never bothered to listen. Malik had learned long ago that silence could be its own kind of power. He didn't need to shout to make his presence known. And today, he wasn't going to let anyone ignore him. Teachers often overlooked him, despite his sharp mind. His hand would shoot up in class with the right answer, but more often than not, it went unnoticed, the teacher calling on someone else instead. Some students even made fun of him for trying too hard, as if being smart was something to be ashamed of. Malik never let their words sting for long. "You'll see," he'd mutter under his breath when no one was looking. Because Malik had a plan. But the truth was, Malik's life wasn't easy. He came from a neighborhood most of the students and teachers at Cedar Heights only knew from news headlines that spoke of struggle, crime, and hardship. His mom worked long hours at 2 different jobs, leaving early in the morning and coming home just in time to kiss him goodnight. She was his hero, even though she rarely said much about their past. As for his dad, well, that was a different story. For as long as Malik could remember, his father had been a mystery, a blank space in the family picture. Malik had asked about him once or twice when he was younger, but his mom's face would always cloud over, her hands tightening on whatever she was holding. "You don't need to worry about that," she'd say softly, and Malik would drop the subject. But now, at 12 years old, Malik was done with unanswered questions. He had pieced together bits of the story over the years, overhearing snippets of conversations between his mom and her sister, finding old papers tucked away in drawers. And then there were the dreams, fuzzy, half-formed memories of a man with a deep voice and strong hands lifting him into the air. At first, Malik thought they were just his imagination filling in the blanks. But something about those dreams felt real. And then, 3 months ago, Malik had stumbled upon something that changed everything. It was an old photo, buried in a box in the back of his mom's closet. In it, his mom looked much younger, standing beside a tall man with broad shoulders and a confident smile. They were holding hands, and there was something familiar about the man's face, something that made Malik's heart pound. On the back of the photo, in faded black ink, were the words, "Me and Charles, Summer 12. Charles. The name buzzed in Malik's mind like a live wire. He couldn't stop thinking about it. Weeks of searching followed on the internet, in old yearbooks, anywhere he could think to look. And then, just when he thought he'd hit a dead end, he found it, a staff photo on the Cedar Heights website. Principal Carter. The face in the photo was older now, with more lines and a touch of gray at the temples, but there was no mistaking it. The man in the picture was the same one from his mom's photo. Malik's principal, Charles Carter, was his father. At first, Malik didn't know what to do with the revelation. Should he tell his mom? Confront Principal Carter? Keep it to himself? For weeks, the secret gnawed at him, growing heavier with each passing day. But one thing was clear, he couldn't stay silent forever. And so, Malik had made up his mind. Today was the day. He had spent the morning replaying every possible scenario in his head, imagining how the moment might unfold. Would Carter deny it? Laugh it off? Or would he look Malik in the eye and admit the truth? Malik didn't know, but he was ready to find out. As the bell rang, signaling the start of the next period, Malik stood rooted in the hallway, watching the other students rush past him. His heart was pounding, but his face was calm. He knew what he had to do. Principal Carter was in his office, just down the hall, the frosted glass of the door glowing faintly from the light inside. Malik took a deep breath, adjusted the straps on his backpack, and started walking. To everyone else, it was just another ordinary day. But Malik knew better. Today, the truth was coming out. As Malik approached the office door, he felt the weight of 1,000 questions pressing down on him. What if he was wrong? What if the man in the picture wasn't his father after all? Or worse, what if he was right, and Principal Carter wanted nothing to do with him? The door loomed larger with each step, the frosted glass blurring the outline of a desk and a figure moving inside. Malik stopped just short of the door, his breath catching in his throat. He hesitated, glancing back over his shoulder at the hallway. Students darted between classrooms, their voices blending into an indistinct hum. Nobody paid him any attention. He clenched his fists. This was his moment. If he turned back now, he'd be carrying the weight of this secret forever. No, he thought. Not today. But before he could raise his hand to knock, the door opened. Malik. Mrs. Henderson, the school secretary, raised an eyebrow. She was holding a stack of papers and clearly on her way to the copy room, but his presence gave her pause. What are you doing here? Shouldn't you be in class? Malik swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. He searched for the right words. I need to talk to Principal Carter. Mrs. Henderson gave him a skeptical look, then glanced back over her shoulder toward the office. The hum of Principal Carter's deep voice could be heard through the open door as he spoke on the phone. Is this about a discipline issue? She asked, her tone softening just a bit. No, Malik said quickly, shaking his head. It's personal. Her eyebrows rose even higher at that, but she didn't press further. Well, he's on a call right now. You'll have to wait. She gestured to the bench against the wall. Sit there until he's done. And make it quick, you're already late for class. Malik nodded and shuffled to the bench. Mrs. Henderson disappeared down the hall, her heels clicking rhythmically against the floor. Now he was alone again, sitting just a few feet away from the man who might hold the answers to every question that had haunted him since he was a little boy. He could hear snippets of the conversation coming from the office. Principal Carter's voice was firm, authoritative, the kind of voice that didn't invite interruptions. But to Malik, it wasn't just the voice of a school principal. It was the voice of a man who might have once whispered lullabies to him as a baby, who might have promised to be there and then vanished without a trace. He closed his eyes, his mind racing back to all the times he'd wondered about his dad. There were moments when it was almost unbearable, like during Father's Day assemblies, when other kids proudly brought their dads to school for breakfast or sports day. Malik would sit quietly in the back, pretending not to care, while inside, he felt like a part of him was missing. Then there were the harder days, like when his mom came home looking exhausted, her eyes rimmed with red, and Malik knew she had been crying. He would sit with her on the couch, not saying anything, just trying to be the kind of son she didn't have to worry about. And through it all, there was always that unspoken question, why wasn't I enough for him to stay? The sound of a chair scraping across the floor pulled Malik back to the present. He opened his eyes and straightened his posture, his heart thudding loudly in his chest. The door to Principal Carter's office opened, and the man himself stepped out. Tall, broad-shouldered, and impeccably dressed, Principal Carter had an air of authority that seemed to fill the hallway. His piercing eyes scanned the space, locking onto Malik almost immediately. "Malik." His voice was sharp, but not unkind. "What are you doing here?" For a moment, Malik froze. All the words he had rehearsed in his mind seemed to evaporate. But then he took a deep breath and stood up. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice steadier than he expected. Principal Carter frowned, glancing at his watch. "Shouldn't you be in class right now?" "It's important," Malik said firmly. "Please." There must have been something in his tone, something unshakable, that made Carter pause. He studied Malik for a long moment before finally nodding. "All right," he said, stepping aside to let Malik into the office. "Come in." The office was everything Malik had expected: neat, organized, and intimidating. A large oak desk sat in the center of the room, flanked by tall bookshelves filled with binders and framed certificates. The walls were lined with photos of Carter shaking hands with important-looking people, receiving awards, and posing with smiling students. Malik's gaze lingered on one photo in particular, a black and white portrait of a younger Carter, standing beside a group of men in military uniforms. He looked strong, confident, the kind of man who seemed to have everything figured out. "Have a seat," Carter said, motioning to the chair in front of the desk as he closed the door. Malik sat down, his hands gripping the edges of his backpack tightly. Carter walked around to the other side of the desk, lowering himself into his chair with a heavy sigh. "So," Carter began, folding his hands on the desk. "What's this about?" Malik hesitated, his throat tightening. This was it. The moment he'd been waiting for. I need to ask you something," he said slowly, carefully choosing his words. "It's about my dad." Carter's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something Malik couldn't quite place. "Your dad?" Carter repeated, leaning back in his chair. Malik nodded, his fingers gripping the straps of his backpack even tighter. "I don't know much about him," he admitted. "My mom never talks about him. But I found a picture of you and her." For the first time, Carter's calm demeanor seemed to falter. His eyebrows furrowed, and he leaned forward slightly, his hands tightening on the edge of the desk. "A picture," he echoed, his voice quieter now. "Yes," Malik said, his voice growing steadier. "It was in a box in her closet. It said, 'Me and Charles, Summer 12. The room felt impossibly quiet, the faint hum of the hallway outside fading into the background. Carter didn't speak, his gaze locked on Malik like he was searching for something. "Is it true?" Malik asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you my dad?" Carter opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. For the first time since Malik had known him, the ever-confident Principal Carter looked unsure of himself. And that, more than anything, was answer enough. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating, until finally, Carter leaned back in his chair, running a hand down his face. "Malik," he said slowly, his voice low and filled with something that sounded almost like regret. This is complicated." "It's not complicated," Malik shot back, surprising even himself with the force of his words. "You either are, or you're not. Which is it?" Carter sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. For the first time, he didn't look like the untouchable figure of authority Malik had always seen. He looked human. "I think we need to talk," Carter said finally. "But not here. Not like this." Malik stood up, his fists clenched at his sides. "Why not?" he demanded. "You've had 12 years to talk. Why now?" Carter didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at Malik, really looked at him, and for a brief moment, there was something in his eyes that Malik couldn't quite read. Was it guilt? Regret? Sadness. I'll tell you everything, Carter said quietly. But you need to trust me. Malik stared at him for a long moment, his heart pounding in his chest. Trust. After everything? He didn't know if he could. But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. The air in Cedar Heights Academy always carried a sharp edge of tension for Malik. It wasn't just the towering walls of polished brick or the pristine hallways lined with plaques and achievement banners. It was the unspoken truth hanging over him that no matter how smart or capable he was, he didn't belong in the eyes of most people there. Cedar Heights prided itself on being the best school in the district, if not the entire state. Parents with deep pockets sent their kids there for a shot at Ivy League colleges and six-figure futures. Malik, however, was the exception. He was here on a scholarship, a golden ticket he'd earned through sheer determination and grades that placed him in the top 1% of his middle school class. But for many students and some teachers he wasn't a rising star. He was an outsider. Whispers followed him in the cafeteria, in the locker rooms, and even in class. Some were careless murmurs, others were loud enough to cut through the noise. Do you think his mom's, like, a maid or something? My dad says they let kids like him in just to check a box. I heard his dad's in jail. Malik had learned to tune out most of it. It wasn't like he hadn't heard worse in the streets back home. Still, the words stuck to him like burrs, itching and stinging no matter how much he tried to brush them off. There was one teacher who always seemed to make things worse, Ms. Bradley, his math teacher. A tall woman with severe glasses and a voice that could silence a classroom in seconds, Ms. Bradley was the kind of teacher who played favorites. And Malik? He was not one of them. Malik, she said one afternoon, her voice dripping with impatience, I've told you before, this class requires focus. If you can't keep up, maybe you should consider a less challenging level. I am keeping up, Malik said quietly, gripping his pencil. Barely, she replied with a dismissive wave of her hand. And I don't have time to keep pulling you along when others are excelling. You need to prove you belong here. The comment stung, not because Malik wasn't doing well he'd aced the last test but because it was a reminder of the uphill battle he faced every day. No matter how hard he worked, someone was always there to tell him it wasn't enough. But it wasn't just the students or teachers. There was also Principal Carter. He wasn't like Ms. Bradley, who clearly didn't like Malik. In fact, he rarely seemed to notice Malik at all. Carter ruled the school with a quiet but unmistakable authority. Students scattered when they saw him coming down the hallway, his tall frame and piercing gaze enough to command respect without a word. For the most part, Malik stayed out of his way. But lately, something had shifted. It started with small moments, Carter catching Malik in the hallway or at the edge of the cafeteria. You again, Malik, his voice was always calm but sharp, like a blade that didn't need to be swung to leave a mark. Do I need to remind you about the rules? Malik would nod, mumble a quick no, sir, and keep walking. But lately, his responses felt hollow, like they weren't enough to mask what he was really thinking. One afternoon, as Malik left the library, balancing a stack of books in his arms, he caught sight of Carter down the hall. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and something passed between them, a flicker of recognition, like a match sparking in the dark. Malik didn't look away this time. Neither did Carter. At home, things weren't much easier. Malik's mom, Monique, worked long hours at a diner during the day and cleaned offices at night. She was a force of nature, a woman who didn't flinch in the face of hardship. But her strength came at a cost. By the time she got home, she was so exhausted she could barely keep her eyes open long enough to ask Malik about his day. How was school? She asked one evening, setting down her keys and collapsing onto the couch. Fine, Malik said, knowing she didn't have the energy for the full story. Any trouble? No. She nodded, leaning her head back against the cushions. Good. Keep it that way, baby. You've got a bright future ahead of you. Don't let anyone mess that up, you hear me? Malik nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He wanted to tell her about the whispers, about Miss Bradley, about Principal Carter and the strange way his stomach twisted every time he saw him. But he couldn't. His mom already carried enough weight on her shoulders. Instead, he pulled out the photo, the one he'd found in her closet, and stared at it. The man in the picture looked so much like Principal Carter that it almost hurt. He wondered if his mom ever thought about him, about Charles. Did she miss him? Hate him? Did she ever wish Malik would stop asking questions about a man who had left them behind? The next day at school, the tension bubbled over. It was gym class, and the students were running laps around the track. Malik kept to the middle of the pack, pacing himself, when one of the older boys, Devin, fell into step beside him. Devin was one of those kids who always seemed to have something to prove. He was taller, faster, and stronger than most of the other students, and he made sure everyone knew it. "Hey, Malik," Devin said, his voice low and mocking. "You trying to set a record for slowest lap or what?" Malik ignored him, focusing on his breathing. "What's the matter?" Devin pressed. "Don't want to talk about your dad? Or do you even know who he is?" The words hit like a punch to the gut, but Malik didn't stop running. He couldn't. "Maybe you should ask Carter," Devin continued with a laugh. "I bet he knows." That made Malik falter. He tripped over his own feet, stumbling to a stop. Devin kept running, laughing as he disappeared down the track. Malik stood there, his chest heaving, anger and shame burning in equal measure. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw Principal Carter standing by the bleachers, watching. Their eyes met, and for a split second, Malik thought he saw something: recognition, guilt, or maybe just curiosity. Whatever it was, it only added fuel to the fire simmering inside him. That night, Malik sat at his desk, staring at the photo again. The weight of everything: school, the whispers, Carter's piercing gaze felt heavier than ever. He thought about what Devin had said. It wasn't the first time someone had made a crack about his dad, but it was the first time it felt like a challenge. Like someone was daring him to confront the truth. And maybe they were right. Maybe it was time to stop running. Malik folded the photo and tucked it into his backpack. Tomorrow, he decided, he wasn't going to avoid Carter. He was going to get answers. For better or worse, the truth was coming. The next morning, Malik woke up before his alarm, his mind already racing. He had barely slept the night before, tossing and turning with questions that wouldn't let him rest. What would Carter say? Would he deny it? Would he admit the truth? What if he laughed in my face? The thought sent a sharp pang of fear through him, but Malik shook it off. He couldn't let himself back down. He couldn't keep living with half-truths and unanswered questions. As he got dressed, he slipped the folded photo into the inner pocket of his hoodie. It felt heavier than a simple piece of paper should, as though it carried the weight of all the memories and possibilities Malik had never dared to explore. When he arrived at school, the hallways were as chaotic as ever: students jostling each other, locker doors slamming, the hum of laughter and chatter filling the air. But to Malik, it all felt distant, like background noise in a movie. His focus was razor sharp, his steps purposeful as he made his way toward Principal Carter's office. But before he could get there, Ms. Bradley intercepted him. "Malik," she called, her voice sharp and impatient. "Where do you think you're going? You're supposed to be in math right now." Malik hesitated, his pulse quickening. He wasn't ready to explain himself, not to her, not to anyone. I need to see Principal Carter," he said, his voice steady despite the knot forming in his stomach. Ms. Bradley raised an eyebrow, her expression a mix of suspicion and disdain. Principal Carter doesn't have time for whatever nonsense you're cooking up, she said. Get to class. Now. For a moment, Malik thought about obeying, about retreating back to the safety of routine and leaving the confrontation for another day. But then he thought about the photo in his pocket, about the way Carter's gaze had lingered on him the day before, and he knew he couldn't wait any longer. It's important, he said firmly, meeting her gaze. Ms. Bradley's eyes narrowed, but before she could respond, a voice cut through the tension. Let him through, Ms. Bradley. Malik turned to see Carter himself standing at the end of the hallway, his expression unreadable. He motioned for Malik to follow him, then turned and walked toward his office without waiting for a response. Ms. Bradley opened her mouth to protest, but Malik didn't give her the chance. He hurried after Carter, his heart pounding in his chest. The walk to Carter's office felt like it stretched on forever. Malik's legs felt heavy, his palms damp with sweat as he followed the tall, imposing figure of the principal. When they reached the office, Carter held the door open and gestured for Malik to step inside. Sit, he said, closing the door behind them. Malik perched on the edge of the chair in front of the desk, his hands gripping the straps of his backpack so tightly his knuckles turned white. Carter settled into his chair on the other side of the desk, folding his hands in front of him. Well? Carter said after a long moment. What's this about? Malik hesitated, his mind scrambling to find the right words. But there was no easy way to say it, no gentle way to break the tension that hung heavy in the air. I need to know the truth, Malik said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Carter's brow furrowed. The truth about what? Malik reached into his pocket and pulled out the photo, unfolding it carefully. He slid it across the desk, his hands trembling slightly. This, he said. Carter picked up the photo and stared at it, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. The silence was deafening, the ticking of the clock on the wall the only sound in the room. Where did you get this? Carter asked finally, his voice low and steady. In my mom's closet, Malik replied. It's from before I was born. She said the man in the picture is named Charles. That's you, isn't it? Carter didn't answer right away. He set the photo down on the desk and leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on Malik. What are you really asking me, Malik? He said. Malik's hands clenched into fists, frustration bubbling up inside him. You know what I'm asking, he said, his voice rising slightly. Are you my dad? Carter sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. For the first time since Malik had known him, the always confident principal looked unsure of himself. Malik, he began, but Malik cut him off. Don't Malik me, he said, his voice shaking. I've spent my whole life wondering who my dad is. My mom won't talk about it, and now I find this. I deserve to know the truth. Carter stared at him for a long moment, and for a brief second, Malik thought he saw something in his eyes, guilt, maybe, or regret. Finally, Carter nodded. Yes, he said quietly. I'm your father. The words hit Malik like a freight train, leaving him breathless. He had spent so long imagining this moment, so long preparing himself for the possibility, but hearing the words out loud was something else entirely. He didn't know whether to feel angry, relieved, or betrayed. Why? Malik asked, his voice trembling. Why did you leave? Why didn't you come back? Carter looked down at his hands, his expression heavy with something Malik couldn't quite place. It's complicated, Carter said finally. Malik scoffed, shaking his head. That's not good enough, he said. You don't just walk away from your kid and call it complicated. I didn't walk away, Carter said, his voice firm. I didn't even know you existed until recently. Malik froze, his mind racing. What do you mean you didn't know? Carter sighed again, running a hand through his hair. "Your mom and we had a complicated relationship," he said. "When we broke up, she didn't tell me she was pregnant. I didn't find out until a few months ago, when she reached out to me." Malik stared at him, his emotions a whirlwind of anger, confusion, and disbelief. "She knew," Malik said, his voice rising. "She knew where you were this whole time and didn't say anything." "I don't know why she made that choice," Carter said. "But when she told me, I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to disrupt your life, and I didn't know if you'd even want me around." Malik laughed bitterly. "You didn't know if I'd want you around? Are you kidding me? Do you know how many nights I spent wondering why I wasn't good enough for my dad to stick around?" Carter flinched, and for the first time, Malik saw something in his expression that looked like genuine pain. "I'm sorry," Carter said quietly. "I know I can't change the past. But I want to make things right. If you'll let me." Malik didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure if he could. The anger and hurt inside him were too big, too overwhelming to process all at once. But as he looked at Carter, he realized something. For better or worse, the man sitting across from him wasn't just a principal. He was his father. And that changed everything. The tension between Malik and Carter didn't resolve in that one conversation. In many ways, it was just the beginning. But for the first time in his life, Malik had something he hadn't had before, a connection, however fragile, to the man who had been missing for so long. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was a start. And sometimes, that was enough. Malik's days at Cedar Heights Academy were no longer routine. The air around him felt different, charged, as though an invisible thread connected him to something just out of reach. He became a fixture in places where no one expected him, silently piecing together fragments of a puzzle only he seemed to understand. One morning, Malik stood near the vending machines outside the teacher's lounge. His hoodie was pulled up, hands tucked into his pockets. He wasn't looking at his phone or chatting with friends, instead, his eyes tracked the comings and goings of the staff. Principal Carter exited the lounge, holding a steaming cup of coffee. His gaze swept the hallway and landed on Malik. "Shouldn't you be in class?" Carter asked, his tone firm but less sharp than usual. Malik straightened up, meeting Carter's eyes without flinching. "I've got 5 minutes until the bell rings," he replied. Carter didn't respond, but his brow furrowed slightly as he walked away. Malik's eyes followed him until he disappeared around the corner. In class, Malik's focus was razor-sharp on some days. On others, he seemed distracted, lost in thought as his pencil hovered over his notebook. When Ms. Bradley called on him, Malik always had an answer, though sometimes his tone carried a hint of defiance. "Pay attention, Malik," Ms. Bradley snapped one afternoon when she caught him staring out the window. "I am," he replied evenly, not looking away from the glass. "I'm just paying attention to different things." The class erupted into muffled laughter, but Ms. Bradley wasn't amused. "See me after class," she said coldly. Malik didn't argue. After the bell rang, he stayed behind, his expression unreadable. "What's going on with you lately?" Ms. Bradley demanded. "You're sharp, Malik, but you've been acting strange. Are you trying to get in trouble?" Malik shrugged, his calm demeanor infuriating. "I'm just figuring some stuff out," he said cryptically. Ms. Bradley sighed, leaning against her desk. "Look, I know things aren't easy for you, but you can't keep testing everyone's patience. If you need help, ask for it. Don't play games." Malik nodded, though his eyes didn't betray whether her words reached him. "Thanks, Ms. Bradley," he said before walking out of the classroom. The real work happened after school, in the library. Malik spent hours poring over yearbooks and old school newsletters. He wasn't sure exactly what he was looking for, but he felt certain the answers lay in the past. One evening, as the librarian began shutting off the lights, Malik stumbled upon a photograph. It was from nearly 2 decades ago, showing a group of staff members from a team-building retreat. His eyes scanned the faces until they landed on a younger, smiling Principal Carter. He wasn't alone in the photo. Beside him stood a woman with warm brown skin and an unmistakable resemblance to Malik's mom. Her hand rested casually on Carter's shoulder, their smiles wide and familiar. Malik's heart raced as he snapped a picture of the yearbook page with his phone. This is it, he thought. They were more than just colleagues. The next day, Malik found himself outside Carter's office again. He wasn't sure what he was hoping for, a slip of the tongue, perhaps, or a reaction that would confirm everything. As Carter stepped out, Malik pretended to be texting on his phone. "Malik," Carter said, catching him off guard. "Why are you always hanging around here? Do you need something?" Malik looked up, feigning innocence. "Nope. Just waiting for my next class." Carter studied him for a moment, then sighed. "If there's something you want to say, just say it. Otherwise, stop loitering." Malik's lips twitched into a smirk. "You'll know when I'm ready, Mr. Carter." The principal's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, Malik turned and walked away. The tension between them didn't go unnoticed. Other students began whispering about Malik's newfound boldness. "What's with you and Principal Carter?" asked Jamal, one of Malik's few friends, during lunch. "You're always creeping around his office." Malik shrugged, pushing his tray aside. "I've got my reasons," he said vaguely. "Bro, you're gonna get expelled or something," Jamal warned. Malik just smiled. "Maybe. Maybe not." One afternoon, Malik decided to confront his mom again. She had been evasive ever since he'd shown her the photograph weeks ago. "Mom," he said, standing in the doorway of the kitchen, "I need you to stop avoiding this." She looked up from the sink, her expression weary. "Malik, I told you already. It's complicated." "I'm not asking for the whole story," he said, stepping closer. "Just tell me this: did you and Principal Carter, were you together?" Her hands froze mid-rinse, and the tension in the room thickened. "Why does it matter?" she asked softly. "Because it matters to me." Malik's voice rose, frustration spilling over. "You can't just expect me to act like none of this is real. I need to know." She turned off the faucet and dried her hands, her back still to him. "We were together for a while," she admitted after a long pause. "But it ended before you were born." Malik's heart pounded. "Did you tell him about me?" Her shoulders sagged, and she turned to face him, her eyes filled with regret. "No," she said. "I didn't think he wanted that kind of responsibility. So I didn't tell him." Malik stared at her, a mix of anger and disbelief swirling in his chest. "You didn't give him a chance," he said quietly. "You decided for him." Her lips tightened, but she didn't argue. "I did what I thought was best at the time," she said. "You'll understand one day." Malik shook his head, stepping back. "I think I understand more than you think," he said before walking out of the room. The following week, Malik's determination grew. He started dropping small hints, not just to Carter but to others as well. During a school assembly, he raised his hand to ask a question, something he rarely did. "Yes, Malik," Carter said from the stage, his voice carrying through the auditorium. Malik stood up, his tone casual but pointed. "Do you believe people should always take responsibility for their actions, even if it's hard?" The question hung in the air, drawing murmurs from the students. Carter's expression remained composed, but Malik saw the flicker of unease in his eyes. "Yes," Carter said after a moment. "I do." Malik nodded, sitting down. His classmates looked at him curiously, but Malik didn't offer any explanations. Each interaction chipped away at Carter's facade. Malik noticed the subtle changes: the way Carter avoided his gaze in the hallways, the way his voice tightened during staff meetings when Malik's name came up. The final straw came during parent-teacher conferences. Malik's mom attended, sitting stiffly across from Carter in the cramped classroom. Malik was supposed to be waiting outside, but he lingered just within earshot. "Malik's been different lately," Carter said, his tone measured. "Is everything okay at home?" His mom hesitated, her voice barely audible as she replied, "He's just figuring some things out. It's been a challenging year." "I see," Carter said, though his tone suggested he knew more than he let on. When they exited the classroom, Malik stepped forward, his eyes locking with Carter's. For a moment, no words passed between them, but the tension was palpable. Soon, Malik thought. Very soon. Over the following days, Malik's behavior became even more calculated. Every step he took seemed deliberate, every word carefully chosen. He wasn't just observing anymore, he was setting the stage for what was coming. The entire school felt it, though no one could quite put their finger on why. Teachers whispered in the lounge, students gossiped during lunch, and even Principal Carter seemed more reserved, his commanding presence slightly subdued. Malik, however, carried himself with a quiet confidence. His usual invisibility had been replaced with a sense of purpose that was impossible to ignore. One afternoon, during gym class, Malik lingered on the sidelines, watching the other kids play basketball. Coach Harris, a gruff man who rarely paid attention to anyone who wasn't a star athlete, noticed him. "Malik, you're up," the coach barked, tossing him the ball. Malik caught it but didn't move to join the game. Instead, he looked at the coach, then glanced over at the bleachers where Principal Carter had just entered the gym, clipboard in hand. "Not today, Coach," Malik said, his voice steady. The gym went silent. No one ever refused Coach Harris. "Excuse me," Harris said, his eyebrows shooting up. Malik held the ball tightly, his eyes locked on Carter. "I've got other things on my mind." Carter's gaze flickered toward Malik, and for a split second, their eyes met. There it was again, that silent challenge, unspoken yet undeniable. "Fine," Coach Harris muttered, motioning for another student to take Malik's place. But the moment lingered, and as Malik sat on the bleachers, he felt the weight of Carter's eyes on him. Later that evening, Malik found himself at the library again. This time, he wasn't just looking at old photos, he was reading through newspaper archives, searching for anything that might fill in the gaps. The librarian, Mrs. Jenkins, approached him cautiously. She had grown curious about Malik's frequent visits and the intensity with which he worked. "Malik," she said gently, "you've been here a lot lately. Is there something you're researching?" Malik hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, kind of. I'm just trying to figure out something about someone." Mrs. Jenkins tilted her head, her curiosity deepening. "Sometimes it helps to talk things out," she offered. Malik gave her a small smile. "Thanks, but I think I need to do this on my own." She didn't press further, but as she walked away, she couldn't help but glance back at him, wondering what secrets he was uncovering. The following morning, Malik arrived at school earlier than usual. The hallways were empty except for the janitor and a few staff members preparing for the day. Malik made his way to the bulletin board outside the principal's office, where photos of past administrators and awards were displayed. He stood there for a long time, staring at a framed picture of Principal Carter from a charity event a few years back. The man looked younger, his smile wider, but the air of authority was still there. Malik reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph he had taken from the yearbook, the one with Carter and his mother. He held it up next to the framed picture, comparing the two. "They're the same," he whispered to himself. It's all connected. By lunchtime, word had spread that Malik had been called to the principal's office. No one knew why, but the rumor mill churned relentlessly. "Malik's finally in trouble," one student whispered. "I heard he's been sneaking around the school after hours," said another. Malik, however, didn't seem worried as he walked into the office. He sat across from Carter, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. "Malik," Carter began, folding his hands on the desk, "is there something you'd like to tell me?" Malik tilted his head, pretending to think. "Shouldn't you be the one asking questions?" Carter's jaw tightened. "I've noticed you've been watching me," he said carefully. "Hanging around places you don't need to be. What's going on?" Malik leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I think you already know, Mr. Carter." Carter's expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened slightly. "Know what?" Malik reached into his backpack and pulled out the yearbook photo, placing it on the desk. "This," he said simply. Carter's eyes flicked to the photo, and for the first time, Malik saw something crack in his facade, just a tiny shift, but it was there. "Where did you get this?" Carter asked, his voice unusually quiet. Malik didn't answer. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, watching the principal closely. "You're in the picture," he said. "With my mom." Carter's face remained unreadable, but his silence spoke volumes. "Do you remember her?" Malik pressed. Carter's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. "This isn't the time or place to discuss personal matters," he said finally, his voice strained. Malik's eyes narrowed. "Then when?" "Because I'm not dropping this." Carter stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "We're done here," he said firmly. "Go back to class." Malik didn't move. He met Carter's gaze with the same unflinching determination he'd shown in the hallway weeks ago. "This isn't over," Malik said quietly before standing and walking out of the office. The tension between them reached a boiling point. Malik continued to piece together fragments of the story, while Carter tried to maintain control, though his usual composure was slipping. The students noticed. "Why's Principal Carter acting so weird lately?" one girl whispered to her friend in the cafeteria. "Maybe it's Malik," her friend replied. "He's been messing with him for weeks." By now, everyone at Cedar Heights Academy knew that something was going on between Malik and Principal Carter, though no one knew what. The whispers grew louder, the stares longer, as the entire school waited for the moment when everything would come to light. And Malik was ready. The truth was coming. All he needed now was the right time to reveal it. The auditorium fell into stunned silence, every pair of eyes bouncing between Malik and Principal Carter. Whispers buzzed at the edges of the room, but most students were too shocked to speak. Teachers exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to intervene or let the moment play out. Carter stepped back from the podium, his face a mixture of disbelief and something darker, fear. "Malik," he said slowly, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. This isn't the place for." "It's the perfect place," Malik interrupted, his voice clear and resolute. "You've been pretending for too long. But the truth always comes out." Carter's lips parted as though he wanted to say something, but no words came. Malik stepped forward, his small frame holding a weight far greater than his years. "You don't even recognize me, do you?" Malik asked, his voice thick with both hurt and defiance. "After all this time, after everything you left behind, you still don't see me?" The audience, gripped by the raw tension, barely dared to breathe. For weeks, Malik had imagined this moment, but standing there now, it felt even heavier than he expected. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph he had carried with him everywhere. "This," Malik said, holding the picture up for the entire room to see, "is you. Standing next to my mom. Smiling. Happy. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the students in the front rows strained to get a look at the photo. Malik turned his gaze back to Carter. You were there. You were part of my life once. And then, one day, you weren't. Carter looked like a man who had been caught in a storm, his composure blown away. He rubbed his temple, his mind racing. Malik, this isn't fair to. Fair. Malik's voice rose, his anger finally breaking through the surface. You think this is about what's fair? Do you know what it's like to grow up wondering why you weren't good enough for your own dad? To watch your mom work herself to the bone just to give you a chance at a better life, while you got to move on like we didn't even exist. Carter staggered, as though the weight of Malik's words had physically hit him. The auditorium was deathly quiet, the students and staff hanging on every syllable. From the back of the room, Mrs. Jenkins, the librarian, watched with wide eyes. She'd suspected something was going on between Malik and Carter, but nothing could have prepared her for this. I tried to figure it out on my own, Malik continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I looked through old yearbooks, old newspapers. I pieced it all together because you wouldn't tell me the truth. But I already know the truth now. Carter finally spoke, his voice cracking. Malik. I didn't know. Don't lie, Malik cut him off sharply. You knew. You've known this whole time. You just didn't want to deal with it. You didn't want to deal with me. A murmur spread through the crowd, students leaning toward one another to whisper frantically. Carter ran a hand down his face, his usual commanding presence reduced to shambles. I didn't think this would ever come out, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. But it did, Malik said firmly. And now everyone knows the truth. You can't hide anymore. Tears pricked the corners of Malik's eyes, but he didn't let them fall. He wasn't going to give Carter or anyone else the satisfaction of seeing him break. Instead, he took a deep breath and turned to the audience. For all of you who've judged me, he said, his voice steady and clear, who've looked at me like I don't belong here because of where I come from or because my mom cleans houses for a living, this is the kind of man you respect. The one who abandoned his own kid. The room erupted into a mixture of shocked gasps and awkward shuffling. Carter's face paled, his authority crumbling under the weight of Malik's words. Malik, Carter said weakly, his voice pleading, please. Let's talk about this, privately. Malik laughed bitterly. Privately? You've had years to talk to me privately, but you never did. Now the whole school knows. The whole world knows. You can't run from this anymore. Carter opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Malik stepped back and addressed the crowd one last time. My mom raised me on her own. She didn't complain, and she didn't ask for your pity. But she deserved better. I deserved better. And now, I'm making sure you all know who he really is. The tension in the room was electric, the silence broken only by the occasional shuffle of feet or the quiet sniffle of someone who couldn't hold back their emotions. Finally, Carter stepped forward, his shoulders slumped. The authoritative principal who once commanded respect with a single look was now a man humbled, stripped of all pretense. You're right, Carter said, his voice trembling. You're right about everything. The room seemed to collectively hold its breath. I was selfish, Carter admitted, his voice heavy with regret. I walked away from responsibilities I wasn't ready to face. I thought you'd be better off without me. Malik shook his head, a mixture of anger and sadness flashing in his eyes. You don't get to decide that. You don't get to walk away and tell yourself it's for the best. That's not what a father does. Carter nodded slowly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I know. And I'm sorry. I know it's not enough, but I'm sorry. The apology hung in the air, its weight palpable. Malik stared at Carter, searching his face for anything that might make up for the years of absence, the pain, the questions. But the emptiness in his chest didn't fade. "I didn't do this for an apology," Malik said finally, his voice soft but resolute. "I did this so you'd have to face the truth. So everyone would know who you really are." Carter's shoulders sagged, his head bowing under the weight of his guilt. The once mighty principal looked like a man defeated, not by a student, but by his own choices. The silence in the auditorium clung to the air like a dense fog, even as Malik walked away. Students and staff sat frozen, unsure whether to follow him or wait for Principal Carter to say anything that might break the tension. But Carter stood on the stage, staring down at the photograph Malik had left on the podium. His hands trembled as he picked it up, his gaze fixed on the younger version of himself, smiling alongside a woman whose face he hadn't allowed himself to think about in years. The weight of his choices, the years of avoidance, and the lie he'd been living pressed down on him like a physical burden. Finally, Carter cleared his throat, though his voice was hoarse when he spoke. "Everyone, assembly dismissed." The students hesitated. No one wanted to leave. Whispers rippled through the room like waves, but slowly, reluctantly, they began filing out, casting glances over their shoulders. As Malik walked down the hallway, his chest heaving with the emotions he'd tried to keep in check, he felt the stares of the students who had followed him out. Their looks weren't pitying anymore, they were curious, even impressed. Malik had done something no one else would have dared to do. A girl from his math class caught up with him. "Hey, Malik," she said hesitantly. He stopped, turning to her. "Yeah. That was," she paused, searching for the right words. "That was brave." Malik offered her a small nod, but he didn't say anything. His mind was still racing, replaying the scene in the auditorium, wondering if he had done the right thing or if there had even been a right thing to do. Meanwhile, back on stage, Carter remained rooted in place. He felt the gaze of the teachers who lingered, waiting for him to address what had just happened, but he couldn't summon the words. Instead, he gripped the photograph tightly, his knuckles white, and walked off stage without looking at anyone. Mrs. Henderson, the school secretary, approached him as he retreated to his office. "Principal Carter," she said softly, her voice laced with concern. "Not now," he muttered, brushing past her. She frowned, but stepped aside. Carter shut the door to his office, locking it behind him. He sat heavily in his chair, staring at the photograph. His mind was a whirlwind of memories, the fleeting relationship with Malik's mother, the moment he decided to walk away, and the years he spent convincing himself it was the right choice. But it wasn't just guilt that gnawed at him, it was the realization that Malik had grown up without him and still stood tall, unbroken. Malik's strength, his determination, was undeniable. Carter had underestimated him, just like everyone else had, and now he was paying the price. For Malik, the rest of the day passed in a blur. Students whispered as he walked by, some offering nods of encouragement, others avoiding his gaze. The teachers, usually quick to call him out for the smallest infraction, left him alone. But Malik didn't care about their opinions. He had spent so long trying to uncover the truth, to hold Carter accountable, that he hadn't thought about what would come next. He found himself sitting under the old oak tree near the school's soccer field, the place he always went when he needed to think. As the afternoon sun filtered through the leaves, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through the pictures he had taken from the yearbook and the archives. One photo, in particular, caught his attention, a candid shot of his mom and Carter laughing together at some event. They looked happy, carefree. Malik traced his finger over his mom's face, wondering what she had seen in the man who had abandoned them. As the school day ended, Malik wasn't surprised to find Carter waiting for him near the gates. The man looked older, wearier, than he had just that morning. "Malik," Carter said, his tone quieter than usual. Malik stopped but didn't speak. He simply crossed his arms, waiting. Carter sighed, running a hand through his hair. Can we talk? Just the two of us. Malik considered it for a moment before nodding. Fine. But this doesn't mean I forgive you. Carter winced but nodded. I understand. They walked to a bench near the edge of the school grounds, away from prying eyes and ears. For a while, neither of them said anything. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Carter spoke. I don't expect you to forgive me. Honestly, I don't know if I deserve it. But I need you to know that walking away from you and your mom, it wasn't because I didn't care. Malik scoffed. Could have fooled me. Carter flinched but pressed on. I was scared, Malik. I was young, and I didn't know how to be a father. I thought leaving would be better for both of you. But I see now how wrong I was. Malik stared at him, his expression unreadable. You thought leaving was better? For who? Because it sure wasn't better for me or Mom. Do you know how hard she worked? How much she gave up? Carter's voice cracked. I know. I know, and I'll never be able to make up for it. But I want to try. If you'll let me. Malik shook his head, the anger bubbling back to the surface. You don't just get to show up now and act like everything's fine. You've missed everything, every birthday, every holiday, every time I needed someone to tell me it was gonna be okay. You weren't there. Carter's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't look away. I can't change the past, Malik. But I can be here now. If you'll let me. Malik stood abruptly, the emotions swirling inside him too overwhelming to process. I don't know if I can, he said, his voice breaking. I don't know if I want to. He turned and walked away, leaving Carter sitting on the bench, the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him. That night, Malik sat with his mom at their small kitchen table. She could tell something was wrong, something bigger than the usual school drama, but she waited for him to speak. Finally, he placed the photograph on the table. Did you know he was here? Malik asked quietly. His mom froze, her eyes widening as she looked at the picture. Malik. Did you know, he repeated, his voice sharper. She sighed, her shoulders sagging. I didn't know, baby. I swear. I had no idea he was working at your school. Malik stared at her, searching her face for any sign of dishonesty, but all he saw was the same tired, loving woman who had done everything for him. What am I supposed to do? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His mom reached across the table and took his hand. You don't have to do anything you're not ready for. But whatever you decide, just remember you're not alone. You've never been alone. The next day at school, Malik felt lighter, though the storm inside him hadn't fully cleared. Carter passed him in the hallway but didn't try to stop him, giving Malik the space he needed. Malik wasn't sure what the future held for them. Forgiveness wasn't something that could be rushed, and trust couldn't be rebuilt overnight. But for the first time, he felt like he had control, like he could decide what happened next, on his terms. The truth was out. And while the road ahead was uncertain, Malik knew one thing for sure: he wasn't invisible anymore. The room was a storm of gasps, murmurs, and stunned faces. Students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and teachers exchanged glances, unsure of what to do next. It felt like the very air had thickened with the weight of what Malik had just said. Carter, the man who had controlled every situation with ease, now stood frozen, his posture slumped, his face pale, and his mouth agape, as if the words Malik had spoken had hit him like a tidal wave. Malik's heart raced, but he held his ground. He had never been this sure of anything in his life. Today, he wasn't just the quiet kid from the wrong side of town. Today, he was taking control of his own story. You think I came here just to embarrass you? Malik said, his voice calm yet powerful. No. I came here to tell you that I've made it this far without you. And I don't need your pity or your excuses. The words hung in the air, heavy with the truth. Carter's usually composed demeanor faltered as the full weight of Malik's declaration sank in. The silence in the auditorium grew thick, almost suffocating, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for him to react. But there was nothing. Carter was stuck. The words he had always relied on, the authority he had carried for years, now betrayed him. Malik wasn't afraid of him. Malik had no reason to fear him. Teachers exchanged nervous glances, their eyes wide with disbelief. How could this be happening? Carter had always been the rock, the man who shaped the school, the one whose word was law. And now, it seemed as if he was crumbling in front of them. Some of the students, who had watched Malik grow up with the quiet determination of someone who refused to be defined by his circumstances, felt a flicker of pride. They had always seen him as more than just another kid. Today, he proved it. Carter took a hesitant step forward, attempting to regain some semblance of control. "We'll talk about this in private," he muttered, his voice shaking slightly, the authority he once held now nothing more than a shadow. But Malik stood his ground, his shoulders squared, his eyes locked on Carter's. "No," he said firmly. "We'll talk about this now." The audacity of it! The courage that Malik displayed sent ripples through the room. Carter's eyes flickered in every direction, as if searching for an escape, but there was no way out now. The truth was out. It was inescapable. He was trapped by his own past, by the choices he had made, and there was no undoing it. For the first time in his life, Carter was silent. Malik didn't back down. He didn't falter. The whole room was waiting for Carter to speak, but the principal had no words. How could he? How could he explain the years of neglect, the lies, the fear that had kept him from being the father he should have been? He had no excuse. He had no way to justify his actions, not when the truth was laid bare in front of him. Malik took a deep breath, his voice unwavering as he continued. "I've spent years wondering why you left. Why you never came back. Why you acted like we didn't matter." His voice broke just a little, but he didn't let it stop him. "You've had all this time to make things right, but instead, you've been running. And I'm done with it. I'm done with you pretending to care when you didn't even have the decency to show up." The room was still. Even the teachers, those who had once seen Carter as the strong, commanding principal, were watching him now with a mix of pity and judgment. His power, which he had relied on to control every situation, slipped away like sand through his fingers. He wasn't the authority figure anymore. He wasn't the leader of this school. He was just a man who had failed, who had run from his responsibilities, and now, the truth was out in the open for everyone to see. Malik took a step back, his gaze still fixed on Carter. "You don't get to walk around here with your head held high anymore. Not after what you've done. You don't get to pretend to be a man of respect when you can't even respect the people who matter most." Carter's face flushed with anger, but there was something else in his eyes: fear. Fear of the consequences. Fear of losing everything. His grip on the podium tightened, but no words came out. He wanted to yell, to argue, to regain control. But there was nothing. Nothing could change the fact that Malik had just exposed him for what he was, a coward, a man who had abandoned his son, a man who had failed. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife, and for a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. It was as if time itself had frozen. Finally, it was Mrs. Henderson, the secretary, who spoke first. She had witnessed this entire exchange with wide eyes. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, "maybe it's time for you to step down." Her voice was quiet, but there was no mistaking the truth in her words. The damage had been done. The students and faculty had seen the cracks in Carter's authority, and there was no coming back from it. Carter turned to her, his face a mix of disbelief and anger. "You can't." "I think we've all seen enough," Mrs. Henderson interrupted, her voice steady and clear. "The students, the staff, they all know what's been happening. And frankly, I think they deserve better." Malik could feel the eyes of the room on him. It was as if he had just taken down the most powerful figure in the school with nothing more than the truth. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to yell. He had simply spoken what everyone else had been too afraid to say. Carter stood motionless, his face pale. There was nothing he could do. The moment was slipping away from him, and he knew it. He had lost his grip on everything he had worked so hard to control. The very students who had once feared him were now looking at him with disdain. And the one person he had failed, the one person he had abandoned, was standing there, looking at him as if he was nothing. Malik wasn't looking for revenge. He wasn't looking for a fight. He had simply come to claim his truth, to put an end to the years of silence. He had made it this far without Carter, and he didn't need him now. Malik wasn't just a kid anymore. He was someone who had learned how to stand tall on his own, even when the world tried to push him down. The room began to clear slowly. Students shuffled out, some casting sympathetic looks toward Malik, others watching him with new respect. Teachers lingered for a moment, unsure whether to offer their support or walk away. Carter's authority, once so solid, had cracked beyond repair. Malik stood there for a moment, his eyes on the door, and then turned to leave. As he stepped out into the hallway, the weight of the moment settled over him. He had done it. He had said what needed to be said. And now, he was free. He wasn't just the invisible kid anymore. He wasn't the son of a man who had walked away. Malik had claimed his own future, his own voice, and no one could take that away from him. The following days were filled with a strange sense of calm. Carter's resignation came just days after the assembly. The school board, unable to ignore the growing dissatisfaction from both students and staff, had no choice but to act. Carter was removed from his position, his legacy tarnished beyond repair. As for Malik, things slowly began to change. He wasn't the quiet kid who slipped under the radar anymore. He was the young man who had stood up for himself, who had faced the truth with courage, and who had earned the respect of those around him. But more than that, Malik realized something important: he didn't need to wait for anyone to tell him who he was. He was in control of his own story. And the future, for the first time, looked like it belonged to him. As for Principal Carter, his fall from grace was swift. He left Cedar Heights Academy, never to return. The lessons he had taught through fear and authority were replaced by a new kind of leadership, one based on trust, respect, and honesty. And the students, once wary of speaking up, now felt empowered to share their voices, knowing that the truth would always come to light. In the end, Malik had not only reclaimed his own story, he had changed the entire narrative of the school. As the school watched the once imposing principal struggle to find his footing, Malik turned and walked out of the auditorium, his head held high. He didn't need to look back. The weight of the moment was still heavy, but it wasn't burdening him anymore. He had said what needed to be said, and now, the truth was out for everyone to see. Malik's steps were steady, his confidence growing with each stride. He had never imagined that one moment, one bold declaration, could change so much. But here he was, standing tall, with the entire school watching as his story unfolded in a way no one could have predicted. Sometimes, the people who try to define you are the ones hiding from their own truth. Principal Carter had spent his life building an image of authority, control, and power. He had used that image to control the students, to make them feel small, like they didn't matter. He had tried to define who they were based on his narrow view of the world. But when his own truth came to light, everything he had built came crashing down. Carter had been hiding from his own failures, his own mistakes, and now the world had seen them for what they were. Malik had always known he was more than what others thought of him. He wasn't just the quiet kid in the back of the classroom. He wasn't the son of a man who had walked away. He was more than the rumors about his family, more than the assumptions people made about him. For years, he had let the world overlook him, waiting for someone to notice. But now, he was the one who would make sure everyone noticed him, not because he craved attention, but because he had something important to say. Walking through the halls, Malik felt a shift. The students who had once ignored him, the teachers who had never really seen him, were all different now. They were looking at him in a new light. They weren't seeing just a kid from the wrong side of town anymore. They were seeing someone who had the courage to speak his truth, to stand up for himself, and to refuse to be defined by anyone else's story. There was something powerful in that moment. Something undeniable. It was the power of owning your own narrative. Malik hadn't waited for someone to give him permission to be heard. He hadn't waited for a perfect moment or for the right words to come. He had simply spoken the truth that had been buried inside him for so long. And in doing so, he had not only changed the way the school saw him, but he had changed the way they saw themselves. His courage had sparked something in them. It had shown them that their own voices mattered, that they didn't have to let anyone, whether it was a principal, a teacher, or a classmate, define who they were. Malik didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. The truth had done all the work for him. As he walked out of the auditorium, a feeling of peace settled over him. The weight of the past, the hurt of years of abandonment, and the fear of not being enough had all started to lift. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. And he was living on his own terms. But there was still something he knew deep down. He had done this for himself, yes, but he had also done it for every other student who felt invisible. Every kid who had been overlooked, dismissed, or judged for reasons they couldn't control. The world often made people like them feel small, made them feel like they didn't matter. But Malik had just shown them that they did. Every voice mattered. Every story mattered. Sometimes, it takes one person to break the silence, to stand up and say what no one else dares to say. Malik had done that. He had taken a step that no one had expected, and in doing so, he had rewritten his own story. He had proven that resilience doesn't come from waiting for the world to change for you. It comes from changing the world by being unapologetically yourself. As the days went on, things at Cedar Heights Academy slowly started to shift. The removal of Principal Carter was only the beginning. The school board had no choice but to acknowledge the truth of what had happened. They couldn't ignore the way Carter had failed the students, the way he had allowed his authority to be built on lies. But the real change was in the students. They were more vocal now, more willing to stand up for what was right. They no longer feared speaking their minds, no longer worried about being silenced. Malik had opened a door for them, and now they had the courage to walk through it. Malik didn't expect everyone to suddenly change overnight. He knew that real change takes time. But what he did know was this: the seeds of that change had been planted, and they were growing. Students who had once kept their heads down were starting to speak out, starting to demand more from the people in power. Teachers who had always played it safe were beginning to question the way things had always been done. Malik had shown them that change was possible, that the truth, no matter how difficult it might be, was always worth fighting for. And that was the lesson he carried with him. The truth might be uncomfortable. It might hurt, and it might cause pain, but it is always, always worth it. Because in the end, the truth is what sets us free. As Malik sat down that evening, reflecting on everything that had happened, he felt a deep sense of pride. He had walked through fire and come out the other side stronger, more sure of who he was and what he stood for. He wasn't the same person who had first walked into Cedar Heights Academy. He was someone who had learned the power of resilience, the strength of his own voice, and the importance of standing up for what's right. And that was something no one could ever take from him. In the years to come, Malik would continue to rise. He would face challenges, of course. Life would throw its curveballs. But he would face them head-on, just as he had faced Principal Carter. He knew that no matter how dark the path might get, he would always have his voice. And with that voice, he would always have the power to change the world. Sometimes, the world tries to define us. It tries to tell us who we should be, what we should think, how we should act. But in the end, we are the authors of our own stories. We don't have to wait for permission to be heard. We don't have to wait for someone to tell us we matter. We have the power to speak our truth, to stand up for ourselves, and to claim the future that's rightfully ours. Malik had learned that. And now, it was his story to tell.